Chapter 2. Gravediggers. Capitalism seems like our destiny. Ever since we started beating animals to death with stones, we've been trading their furs. Adam Smith wrote about humanity's propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. We've been doing that in markets for millennia. Have the seeds of capitalism always existed, not just in our societies, but in our souls? A close look at the system's rise reveals something else, namely, that it was an accident. In most accounts, capitalism appeared sometime between the 14th and 16th centuries, as our tendency to seek market opportunities finally saw people begin to break free of the shackles of feudalism, and as Florence, Venice, and other disruptive city-states traded and innovated Europe out of the muck of the Middle Ages. But this story isn't right. Capitalism didn't come about because markets grew to a certain point. Instead, what we understand as capitalism resulted from a societal shift, as we went from using markets from time to time to producing for the market as our all-consuming task. And capitalism didn't start in the grand cities of the Italian Renaissance, but in some soggy fields on a backward island. England, by virtue of a few distinctive facts about its agriculture, became the world's greatest power, and later the first home of the industrial proletariat, whom Marx and generations of socialists placed their faith in. Before capitalism, feudalism was the dominant system across much of the world. Under it, people were divided between the majority who worked the land to survive and the small minority who appropriated the majority's labor through political coercion. Peasants had access to their own land, thus access to the means of their survival. However, lords used laws and force of arms to extract a portion of their yield. With these proceeds, they purchased luxuries the producers couldn't afford and expanded their military power. This helped them not only cement their standing in relation to other lords and their realm's monarch, but also fend off peasant revolt. The system didn't encourage growth or innovation. Peasants knew that if they produced more for exchange, much of it would go to their lords. They also mostly grew a variety of subsistence crops, rather than specializing in a cash crop. Feudalism faced periodic demographic crises, none more significant than the Black Death, which ravaged Eurasia in the 1300s. As much as 20% of the world's population perished, and close to half of all people in Europe. As soon as it recovered, the continent plunged into warfare and revolt. The ruling class reasserted its control in Eastern Europe, where peasants had their autonomy stripped through an even more extreme system of feudalism called serfdom, which, by the mid-1600s, bound them to estates and criminalized flight. In France, by contrast, the peasants managed to secure de facto ownership of their land and gave less of their yields to lords. The French lords themselves increasingly became functionaries of a centralized, absolutist state. A middle ground prevailed in England. Peasants stopped their ruling class from extracting a greater surplus from them through brute force, but they failed to win legal land rights. English lords, searching for new ways to produce surpluses beyond exploiting the depleted peasantry, laid the groundwork for a shift from peasant proprietor production to a tenant system. Tenants received 1- or 2-year leases and had incentives to be ever more productive, since they kept all the surplus after their rent was paid. Landlords had every reason to support these developments, which allowed them to create a market for land leases. The more productive the farmers, the higher the leases could go. Tenant farmers were compelled by the market to maximize production in a way peasants weren't. These farmers, in turn, began hiring landless peasants and others as wage laborers. It may sound like a small shift, but in fact it was an epochal transformation. More and more land in England came under this system. The process created a highly productive agriculture sector able to sustain a large population not engaged in farming. It also meant that there was a majority without property that could be essentially forced into wage labor and become a market for cheap consumer goods. For the first time in history, a society became subordinated to markets and elites ruled by, as Karl Marx put it, the dull compulsion of economic relations rather than political coercion. There had been markets before, indeed going back thousands of years, but early modern England was the world's first market society. The old customs and obligations that had held people together cracked, as did the stability that hereditary access to land and communal rights offered. Most people resisted their conversion to wage laborers, preferring even vagrancy to the odd new way of life. The state tried to cut off other avenues of survival by banning poaching, hunting, fishing, and foraging from formerly common lands. The 1744 Vagrancy Act offered stern punishment for those who refused to work for the usual and common wages. A series of enclosure acts privatized communal property, further eroding the possibility of living off the land. Spurred by the accident of capitalism, the English population increased sevenfold between 1520 and 1850, and the proletariat's number multiplied by 23. The losers in this process would in time be transformed into an industrial working class with incredible latent power. Other countries soon began to emulate England's astonishing productivity increases, but it still had tremendous advantages over its competitors. Even before the Industrial Revolution, England was home to major technological advances. Newcomen's steam engine revolutionized mining, and in 1721, Lawham's silk mill, Britain's first factory, foreshadowed the radical shifts to come. The 1780s witnessed the start of what became known as the Industrial Revolution. New manufacturing methods emerged. Starting with mechanized spinning, the textile industry was one of the first to be transformed, processing raw cotton harvested by the Americas' slaves. Eventually, hand production in other sectors gave way to machines. That Britain was at the helm of industrialization was never in doubt. In 1800, it produced 10 million tons of coal, while its nearest rival, France, produced only 1 million. Even before the Industrial Revolution, more than half of Britain's population was engaged in labor other than agriculture, but it took several more decades for the landscape to be truly transformed by railroads, steamships, and heavy industry. Capitalists used the new technologies to create great factories that required a disciplined, centralized workforce. But the would-be urban proletariat had to be lured to cities first. Fortunately for the capitalists, the agricultural revolution and consequent population boom left many in poverty. Fleeing the countryside for the city was one way out. Wage labor was just as unappealing for them as it was for the agrarian proletariat, but the impoverished had little chance of survival otherwise. They were joined in the new factories by Irish immigrants fleeing the devastating Great Famine. Once in cities, workers had to be radically retrained. The capitalist clock was nothing like the seasonal labor many were used to in the countryside, or the less methodical pace in artisanal workshops. Harsh discipline and low wages remolded humans, many of them women and children, into creatures who did little but labor. When not chained to machines for 12-hour shifts, they lived amid smog and dust in cramped, disease-filled quarters. Visiting mid-19th century Manchester, a center of English industry, the French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville remarked, "Here humanity attains its most complete development and its most brutish. Here civilization works its miracles, and civilized man is turned almost into a savage." Around the same time, Friedrich Engels described an English capitalist, decent and respectful, a good husband with private virtues, who listened politely to complaints about workers' conditions before replying, "And yet there is a great deal of money made here." Engels was a figure every bit as remarkable as his famous collaborator Karl Marx. He was born in 1820 to a wealthy merchant family, and at 17 was sent to Bremen, one of Germany's largest commercial cities, to work as a business clerk. Engels rebelled against his father, a fanatical and despotic textile manufacturer, and sought to free himself through radical philosophy. When he later served in the artillery guards of Berlin, Engels proved to be a terrible soldier, but a sharp and energetic mind. In the city's beer halls, he associated with a rambunctious group of young Hegelians and was drawn to a kind of democratic republicanism, Jacobin, which is to say radical in its spirit. His father endeavored to cure him of his political sentiments by condemning Friedrich to middle management at a textile mill he owned in Manchester. The city had recently risen to prominence as a hub of the Industrial Revolution. Without schooling or access to basic sanitation, the workers attracted to Manchester feared losing their jobs, knowing that utter destitution was never far away. Little of the great wealth they helped create went to them. For his part, Engels saw them as destined for something greater than poverty. From 1842 to 1844, he investigated firsthand the nature of capitalist production by day, and at night explored the city's underbelly. He forsook the company and the dinner parties, the port wine and champagne of the middle classes, and made genuine connections with workers by discussing their grievances and acting in solidarity with their struggles. Engels lived a double life in the sense that he had fine lodgings in a nice part of town, but spent most of his time in rented rooms in working-class districts. His allegiances, however, were never in doubt. In Manchester, Engels met and fell in love with an Irish woman, Mary Burns, who had been doing factory work since she was a small child. Mary and other friends were his guides to the city's south side, where tens of thousands of Irish workers lived, and to other neighborhoods few other bourgeois people even set foot in. At just 24, Engels wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England. The bland title did not convey that it was a work of both insight and anger. Even more than Charles Dickens, Benjamin Disraeli, and other social critics of the time, Engels captured the life of the industrial proletariat. He described the London slums living quarters, where filth and tottering ruins surpass all description, and no doors are needed, there being nothing to steal. He wrote of garbage and ash, foul liquids oozing on the street, and residents losing daily more and more of their power to resist the demoralizing influence of want, filth, and evil surroundings. A clearly outraged Engels reminded readers that all this was taking place in the richest city of God's earth. The same barbarity was evident in Liverpool, where 45,000 people lived packed into fewer than 8,000 badly ventilated cellars, and in the overwhelmingly working-class Glasgow. But the most vivid passages in the book concerned the horrors of Manchester, whose 350,000 working people were robbed of all humanity, degraded, reduced morally and physically to bestiality. Inside the factory that made his family rich labored women made unfit for childbearing, children deformed, men enfeebled, limbs crushed, whole generations wrecked, afflicted with disease and infirmity. And yet, Engels thought the stunted, oppressed class he came to know could have great political power. Not all workers were passive in the face of poverty and abuse. Luddites, the machine breakers maligned in the popular imagination, fought against the acceleration of work, in the recognition that technological advance didn't mean progress for them. In 1830, agricultural workers in Kent destroyed grain threshers, and sent letters to local elites demanding wage increases under the ominous pseudonym Captain Swing. Less provocative, but even more threatening to capitalists, were early efforts at trade unionism and Chartism, a movement that arose in 1838 and sparked struggle for universal suffrage. Unrest simmered across much of Britain and was brutally put down by state authorities. In January 1851, The Economist, a magazine founded to promote free trade, rhapsodized that it was a happiness and a privilege to have had our lot cast in the first 50 years of this century, a period that had witnessed a leap forward in all the elements of material well-being such as neither scientific vision nor poetic fancy ever pictured. The periodical's assessment of the Industrial Revolution was partially true, but capitalism, that accident of history, had conjured a dangerous combination: immense, lucrative industries and a deprived and discontented class of people locked within them. This was the reality in which Marxist theory was first constructed. Jordan and Pippin, Sonny and Cher, Marx and Engels. One of history's great partnerships was forged with a week of drinking and conversation in Paris. Like Engels, as a teenager, Karl Marx wanted nothing more than to escape the boredom and conservatism of the Rhineland. He did have the advantage of a liberal father, who only offered mild rebukes of his brilliant son's dueling and boozing. Though respected by his peers, Marx kept radical company at university, attracting the attention of Prussian authorities and sinking his chances at an academic career. He turned elsewhere, marrying the rebellious aristocrat Jenny von Westphalen and traveling to Paris to pursue a career in journalism. Marx was fortunate enough to meet Engels in the French capital. Through his new friend, he learned about the realities of industrial capitalism and shifted his attention away from philosophy and toward political economy. Even more important, Engels was willing to be his benefactor as he pursued writing and politics. Kicked out of Paris for their writings, they lived in Brussels between 1845 and 1848, where they joined the Communist League and organized German-speaking workers. They also continued quarreling with more prominent radicals, including Karl Grun, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Wilhelm Weitling, and the followers of Louis-Auguste Blanqui. Marx and Engels consistently advocated for a democratic politics, driven by the mass of workers themselves, to the point that the day's insurrectionists could call them moderates. Their talents, however, still commanded respect, and the pair was commissioned by the Communist League to write the Communist Manifesto, which was published on the eve of the 1848 revolutions. The final draft drew on the ideas of both men, but it was composed entirely by Marx. The bourgeoisie, the manifesto argued, has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. Driven to expand and find new markets, the capitalists described by Marx are revolutionaries, dissolving all fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions. It's a better description, perhaps, of what capitalism has accomplished by 2018 than of its record in 1848. For all their wonder at these new developments, Marx and Engels claimed that the system's contradictions were only mounting as it matured. Along with modern industry, the bourgeoisie produced its own gravediggers, the proletariat. These workers had a reason to overthrow capitalism and replace it with a production system governed in their interests. Though it has been debated and scrutinized like no other work since the Bible, the Communist Manifesto was a short document written on the eve of an international revolution to popularize a political program. Its most important legacy was in laying out definitions of capitalism and communism, an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, and describing the working-class agent at the heart of future transformations. Prior socialisms had embraced the underclass, sought the philanthropy of elites, crafted utopian schemes, or gazed backward to the agrarian past. Marx and Engels instead proposed galloping forward alongside modernity. Marx and Engels hoped that the revolutions of 1848 would be the immediate prelude to the proletarian revolution. Unrest had started in France but quickly spread to Germany, then Italy, Hungary, and a half-dozen other European countries. The contagion even reached Colombia and Brazil. But the specter of communism wasn't haunting the capitalist world. Radical republicanism was. Workers, artisans, and even some peasants demanded reforms such as minimum wages, suffrage, and state-provided education. Even when their demands were focused around challenging the aristocracy, they nevertheless found few allies in the bourgeoisie. If anything, Marx's mistake was in overestimating the political interest of capitalists to sweep away the old vestiges of feudalism. In the aftermath of 1848, he advocated that workers fight for their rights in new organizations, sometimes allied with, but fundamentally independent of, the erstwhile liberal bourgeoisie. Some governments were toppled, but many of the regimes survived or re-emerged. While other socialists responded to the defeats of 1848 by receding into conspiratorial radicalism, in the years that followed, Marx wedded himself sincerely to workers' causes. He engaged with the Chartists and later helped found the International Working Men's Association, or IWA. When trade unionism spread in the 1850s and 60s, Marx saw potential in the movement. The Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin and others rejected the often politically conservative unions, but Marx interpreted them as a sign of an increasingly self-organized and class-conscious movement, prerequisites for the struggles that could lift workers out of misery. At the same time, Marx, Jenny, and their growing family were miserable themselves, an infernal mess of poverty and woe. He was living in London on whatever Engels sent him and the pittance he earned from his journalism for the New York Daily Tribune. Marx was hounded by bill collectors and suffering from ill health when he began writing his masterwork, Capital, in 1852. By then his thinking had matured. He was a historical materialist, which meant that he thought various forms of society reflect different material possibilities and constraints. Modes of production moved in stages, and each stage yielded a certain set of social relations. As Marx wrote in The Poverty of Philosophy, "The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist." Like previous modes of production, capitalism would eventually become a fetter on development and would have to be replaced by another. This wasn't necessarily a determinist argument. Marx believed that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Agency, through class struggle, was the motor of history, though it was molded by context. In Theses on Feuerbach, Marx criticized the vulgar materialism of the young Hegelians, who downplayed the role of political actors in changing society, and described history as an interplay of circumstance and human activity. Even without the insights of historical materialism, anyone living amid the Industrial Revolution knew that their era was profoundly unlike previous ones. In Capital, Marx explained more convincingly than anyone else how it came about, as well as its defining features. The effort took him 15 years. All the while, he recalled The Unknown Masterpiece, his favorite Honoré de Balzac short story. In it, a painter, Fraunhofer, spends a decade perfecting a portrait meant to be the most complete representative of reality. When he discovers that all he has produced is a woman's foot and a confused swirl of colors, he destroys his painting and dies. When it was finally released in 1867, the first volume of Capital won no great fanfare. Like Fraunhofer, Marx must have despaired, thinking himself a failure. But as the late scholar Marshall Berman pointed out, and Balzac had no way of knowing, the painter's great work is in fact a perfect description of a 20th century abstract painting. Capital received its widest acclaim after Marx's death, and it certainly reads like a modernist work in that it's made up of layers upon layers of satire, metaphor, and allusion. If you search through its web of footnotes, you'll find denunciations of dwarf economists and references to Don Quixote and Sophocles. All of this might have made the volume more confusing than it needed to be, but the core of Capital is a clear demystification of capitalism. Marx showed how natural resources, capital, and human labor had been harnessed through organization to create great wealth. Under earlier modes of production, people bartered by exchanging commodity C for commodity C. Later, money M helped us mediate those transactions. We sold commodities in return for money that we used to purchase another good, C, M, C. Capitalists, however, relate to exchange differently. They used money from commodity sales to invest in production in order to make more goods than they were then compelled by competition to sell at a profit, MCM. Much of the resulting yield was thrown back into making more commodities in the restless, never-ending process of profit-making. If capitalists ever slowed down or showed any mercy, they would get swallowed up by their rivals. But Marx, of course, didn't just see markets and commodities when examining capitalism. He saw the labor of millions ensnared by it. In all but the most primitive societies, labor beyond a subsistence level created a surplus, and any surplus was appropriated, consumed, or otherwise directed by elites. Under feudalism, exploitation was obvious. If peasants had to give 40% of their yield to their lord, they knew that out of the 50 days they labored in the fields, they were only reaping the rewards of 30. Marx pointed out that similar dynamics existed under capitalism. Workers couldn't just be employed for the necessary working time required to ensure their existence. Capitalists kept their firms profitable by extracting surplus value through extending the working day or increasing the pace and efficiency of production. It's easy to understand this concept on production lines. If you're bottling 100 curry pasta sauce jars an hour, 60 of those might be necessary to pay your wages and other overheads, but every jar after that is surplus. Some goes directly into a capitalist's pockets, but much of it is reinvested into production to keep firms competitive. Socialists call this phenomenon exploitation. Marx believed there were ways to diminish exploitation short of ending capitalism completely. He was a vigorous advocate of the United Kingdom's Factory Act of 1847, because it restricted the working hours of women and young people in mills to 10 hours a day. It was a politically imposed limit on the extent of capitalist exploitation, and thus a triumph of the political economy of the working class. Capital was presenting a theory, and like all theory, its goal was to simplify an almost infinitely complex reality to arrive at certain truths. It was a critique of the ascendant political economy of the time, not a completely fleshed-out alternative body of political economy, and it was concerned with the broad contours of capitalism, not its fine-grained details. Still, capital remains a profound accomplishment. Marx wrote of a system prone to crises, always close to spiraling out of control, but still incredibly dynamic. He brings to light conflict and the subordination of person to person, but also the subordination of all people to the market. We can recognize the same forces acting on us today whenever we stress over bills, worry about our relationship to our bosses, or wonder why so many of them seem to be sociopaths. The market demands it. Marx's hope, however, was that a system with people at the core could be consciously changed. What a successor system might look like, Marx only vaguely indicated. He didn't want to fall into the same trap of the utopian socialists, such as France's Saint-Simon and Britain's Robert Owen. They spent their energy writing detailed blueprints for the future, but had no strategy to realize them besides the goodwill of elites. What's more, they suffered from a profoundly anti-democratic sensibility. Marx believed that socialism came from the struggles of workers, not the plans of a few intellectuals. In The German Ideology, Marx did describe an end of history, communism. He wrote of a world without states and with class divisions overcome, in which society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. This passage is often ridiculed for its utopianism, but it's a provocation to imagine a future where abundance reigned and people were freed from social constraints. Marx recognized the need for a transition period, socialism, or what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. This would come about after the ruling class was dispossessed, but also with the world in every respect still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. As opposed to post-political communism, socialism essentially meant radical democracy. The use of the word dictatorship, which has left the phrase open to critique, meant something specific in Marx's usage. The meaningful distinction to Marx was between personal dictatorships and social dictatorships, in which an entire class had a say in governance. Broadly, the task of a dictatorship of the proletariat would be to introduce new economic and social measures and slowly lay the groundwork for the communist future. Though Marx introduced the concept in his writings on the 1848 revolution, most of his ideas about working-class rule appear in his discussions of the Paris Commune. The Commune was a radical government that briefly flowered in 1871 after the collapse of Napoleon III's regime. The Commune, as Marx wrote, was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short terms. It was a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. It was not, in other words, an authoritarian dictatorship. Marx described an egalitarian, participatory democracy. When the Paris Commune was brutally crushed by the Versailles government, Marx eulogized it, writing that it would be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. He lamented that the communards hadn't gone far enough in destroying the capitalist government or taking control of more levers of economic power. In the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, Marx presented an immediate set of demands for the socialist movement. If successful, they would have resulted in a society where a radically transformed democratic state held formerly private property and used it rationally under the direction and to the benefit of the people. How this would work in practice was beyond the scope of Marx's ambition, and anyway the question never came close to relevancy in his lifetime. Marx could not have been expected to see perfectly into the future, but he proved remarkably far-sighted. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776 and died in 1790. He only saw the very beginning of capitalism. It was Marx who gazed at the great factory cities, steamboats, and railroads, and guessed that more marvels were to come. It was also Marx who never lost sight of the human cost of progress. His moral outrage made him a socialist, but he spent far more of his life examining capitalism than envisioning an alternative to it. Humanity might have always been trucking, bartering, and exchanging, but we've also been dreaming of cooperation and equality at the same time. In Buddha's rebellion against the caste system, in the Hebrew Bible's ire against those who rob poor ones of justice, in Christianity's revolutionary humanism, and in generations of peasant revolt, we've seen egalitarian ideas appear and take hold. The French Revolution of 1789 trumpeted the Enlightenment dream of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Its appeal has never been extinguished, but it has been frustrated by capitalism, the very system that creates the riches to make it achievable. Despite his prescience, and despite his belief in capitalism's capacity to transform and adapt, Marx could not have foreseen the welfare states of the 20th century, or how ordinary workers could rise out of poverty and even become consumers of luxury goods. But the core of the system he described is little changed. Capitalism is crisis-prone, is built on domination and exploitation, and for all its micro-rationality, has produced macro-irrationalities in the form of social and environmental destruction. It's also a truly universal system. When Marx wrote in the manifesto that all that is solid melts into air before capital's might, it had barely spread beyond the West. Now, finally, capitalism reigns supreme in all corners of the world. More improviser than prophet, what Marx left us wasn't scripture, but a method of looking at the world and a set of concerns to animate us. Over the years he revised and constantly questioned his own thought, but remained consistent as a Democrat and a believer that the majority had an interest in its own self-emancipation. If we can fault him for anything, it's for how unqualified that faith was, and for underestimating how capitalism could find ways to mitigate, if not solve, its contradictions. Marx's fate over the past century has been a sad one. He once said his favorite motto was, "Doubt all things." But under authoritarian regimes, Marxism was turned into a science that allowed no room for doubt. Dialectical materialism became rigid, a dogmatic caricature used to produce insights on everything from genetics to theater art. But Marx should be saved from being rendered toothless by today's academics, too. He wasn't an innocent bystander just trying to understand capitalism. Philosophers have only interpreted the world, Marx famously wrote. The point is to change it. True to his word, Marx was just as much a pamphleteer and an activist as he was a theorist. He left behind thousands of pages of notes, correspondence, and passionate political interventions. There was a reason Marx was chased from country after country by state agents. In 1883, as his friend was being buried, Engels reminded mourners that Marx was, before all else, a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute, in one way or another, to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it had brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat. Marx's sprawling ideas were meant to be taken and made useful for future struggles, vulgarized necessarily perhaps, but still true to their radically democratic essence. In the 12 years between Marx's death and his own, Engels helped refine and propagate the materialist conception of history among movements of workers who were turning to socialism. No movement was larger, more influential, or more loyal to Marxism's founders. than the Social Democrats of their homeland.